Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and today I just really want to get something off my chest, and you'll know from the title of the video what it is, and that is essentially my frustration at the fact that no one has a clue where the weapons on the original Enterprise are. It obviously has them. It has Phasers and Photon Torpedoes. Do we know how many? No. Do we know where they're placed? No. Or at least not for certain, not certainly in any kind of on-screen canon. There are secondary explanations, there are some illustrations, and there are some, obviously, the games, FASA, Starfleet Battles. Simply put, no one officially has ever said where the weapons on the original Enterprise are, and today I aim to rectify that issue. Like I say, the original Enterprise has a very ill-defined armament, and VFX don't help. I mean, that seems to just be the motto of the VFX guys on Star Trek. We're going to confuse you. So let's get into it. So, a lot of people have come up with the explanation. Axanar is included, as is Strange New Worlds and Resurrected Starships, have all concluded that actually the Enterprise should just have the same armament as it did in the motion picture. Now, I don't really like that explanation, even though that was potentially Gene's original intent. Gene says that the motion picture Enterprise was the Enterprise he always wanted. Star Trek canon is more than what Gene says, particularly when we're talking about the technical rules. There's a lot of rules that just get broken later on and no one bats an eye these days, so let's not set too much stock by purely what Gene Roddenberry says. Another problem I have with that idea is that it basically makes the TMP refit, I mean, what's the point of it? I think there is a very specific reason that the TMP refit happens, and I will get into that in the video once I explain what I think the actual armament is. But by just doing the same armament on the original Enterprise, it makes that refit somewhat pointless. Whereas I think that actually the refit represents a very significant shift in how the Enterprise operates, tactically speaking. Put simply, with motion picture, you're looking at a crowd control capable ship with an emphasis on linear engagement. In original series, what we see is a ship that heavily emphasizes mobility and one-on-one maneuver battles. And that will play into how this armament now makes sense. So our best reference is from the Defiant in The Mirror Darkly, which uses, is pretty accurate to at least the TOS effects. Our other main reference is going to be FASA. Now, this is where it gets interesting. You see, in The Mirror Darkly has a pretty decent, well-rounded portrayal of the Constitution's weapons, and it seems to be mirrored by this FASA armament. In FASA, it is armed with 6, we'll call, medium phasers. They may be heavy, they may be medium, but there's 6 of them, and from these cutaways you can see they are mounted in both cutaways. These are 2 cutaways by 2 different illustrators. They are both mounted dorsally, below the bridge. You can see that they're sort of heavier because they are, 3 balls rather than the ventral set, which are only 2 ball. Call them medium or heavy, whichever you want. But they are very clearly the heavier battery of phasers, and you have 6 of them arranged in a conventional 3-point setup, so 2 port, 2 prow, 2 starboard. And that is effectively the Enterprise's main battery. And we do at times in the original series, particularly I think a little bit more in the remastered, we do see it firing from the dorsal quarters, which makes sense. Otherwise it could only fire from its ventral quarters, and that's not much of the time. I think giving it a dorsal phaser battery makes plenty of sense. It then also says that there are 2 light batteries, one in the saucer, and that of course is going to be that ventral turret, and then one aft, which is below the shuttle bay. Now the part where we kind of hit a bit of a snag is with reference to the torpedo launch. As you see in The Mirror Darkly, it very, very clearly states that the Defiant has aft torpedo launchers. We never see the Enterprise in the original series make use of an aft torpedo launcher, and the FASA stats state that they are both prow And the cutaways themselves do not show any aft torpedo launchers, nor any space where there perhaps could be an aft torpedo launcher. They show the torpedo launcher in the saucer above the ventral phaser turret. Now, originally I was a little bit torn on this idea of, should it not have aft-facing torpedoes? That seems like a pretty important thing. And then I thought about it a little bit more. And actually I realized that not many ships of this period have aft-firing torpedoes. The Klingon D7 does not. That comes later in the Katinga refit. Most ships of this period do not have aft-facing torpedoes. The only ships that I can think about that actually do actually have aft torpedoes are the Klingon D6 from Axanar and the D5 from Enterprise. And again, since both of those are, technically non-canon designs, you can, just rub those launchers out if you want. Or you just say that, like, for them, those were their 2 torpedo launchers and, they've just got less capacity in other respects. Whatever. There's ways you can balance it. But it makes a lot of sense that the Enterprise doesn't actually have aft torpedoes. Aft torpedoes, you've got to take into account where we are in the timeline and where we are with technology at this point. Warp speed combat very much is a thing, and of course you do need torpedoes for warp speed combat, but it plays out very differently in this period. Warp speed combat is not the kind of linear pursuit that we'll see later on in the 24th century, or these, full warp speed interceptions head to head. Warp speed combat in this period is much more staggered. So basically, ships will enter warp and drop out of warp to jostle for position and exchange fire. So jostle for that advantageous position. Once that person is in the disadvantaged position, he'll have to drop out of warp to reposition. You drop out of warp, you fire your main weapons. This ultimately comes down to, you've got to remember, looking at the Enterprise of this period and the fact that its 2 torpedo launchers are in the ventral saucer, it doesn't have a colossal amount of ammunition. I don't know what the numbers are suggested to be for the Enterprise's torpedo complement, but I can imagine it being very, very light. I don't think it's going to carry much in the way of torpedoes, depending on how much of that ventral saucer you want to take up with ammunition. And again, you could probably say a similar thing for the D7. It's like, how many torpedoes can you realistically store in the ventral head section? Yeah, probably not too much. By the 24th century, of course, torpedoes are carried in enough numbers that you can just feasibly have these warp speed engagements where you're just exchanging torpedoes. But you don't really have the ammunition to do that in the 23rd century. If you want to get a decisive outcome in the engagement, you're going to have to drop out of warp and engage with your energy weapons. And so, for that reason, having an aft torpedo launcher isn't nearly as important as being maneuverable and having superior warp speed and warp maneuverability, things like that, which is very much where the emphasis of the design for the original Constitution class ship really comes from. There's much greater emphasis on creating a ship that is very mobile, and that we see in the series as actively mobile. And once you realize that that is, how it is designed, and that is the priority, is the mobility, well then suddenly the rest of the armament makes a whole lot more sense, because of course then suddenly, instead of just having this what appears this very powerful forward arc and weak rear arc, unlike in the motion picture where the Enterprise has a much more well-rounded armament, well suddenly now we actually have an Enterprise which has a very forward-facing armament, but that's because it comparatively for the period, it's much faster and much more maneuverable. And then certainly if you take into account that it came into service before the D7, that's a whole thing arguing with FASA, but sort of taking little bits from what we've been given in Disco and Strange New Worlds, then they actually confirmed that the Constitution is older than the D7, and so it makes sense that when the Constitution came out, it probably was the fastest and most agile thing on the block. Combine that with this very powerful prow, dorsal phaser battery, and then suddenly you have a very, very dangerous threat to the Klingon D6. and that it doesn't really have any response to. The D6 is very much locked into a forward-oriented loadout and is probably not as maneuverable or as fast as the Constitution. So, with that rant over, I think you understand now how the Constitution class and the other ships of this period would fight. And that's kind of why I wanted to delve into the armament of the original Enterprise. Because I ultimately wanted to find out how space combat, played out in this period. Yes, we have the visual evidence from TOS, but that's not very much. It's effectively visual effects placeholders. It doesn't really show us a great deal. So what we have by doing this is now a better understanding of how combat played out, particularly in this TOS period. Like I say, it then also makes the motion picture era very unique, because it turns, the motion picture era, we go from this very mobile style of combat that we see in TOS, and that is very much indicated in the remastered visuals, at least, to this much more, static Age of Sail style close range exchanges of gunnery, and mass volleys of weapons. Whereas with this style of design, the Enterprise actually has a very limited armament. Apart from the secondary weapons, being the ventral and aft phaser turret, your main weapons are your dorsal phaser battery and your 2 torpedo launchers, and that's it. That's it. That makes it very much a far cry from what we see during the motion picture, where all those phasers around the surface of the Enterprise are probably just as powerful as those dorsal weapons were. And then, part of the reason they could do that, the new warp core, more power, and also those phasers are tied into that warp core, so more energy to the phasers. They're way more powerful, and you can have way more of them. And you can feasibly engage in those that kind of crowd control fighting style, as opposed to in this period where the emphasis very much is in building a ship that can win in a very mobile, high-speed battle space, in which combat is often going to be taking place over a wide area between small numbers of ships. And again, we kind of see that in the Ultimate Computer. Enterprise opens fire under the control of the M5, opens fire on the Excalibur and Constellation, and it does incredible amounts of damage very, very quickly, even with their shields fully up. And that to me suggests the power of that dorsal phaser battery. That's probably a very, very powerful armament. That is probably the primary weapon of the original Enterprise, rather than that ventral setup that we see, which is probably more of a defensive and support weapon. It would then also explain why we see quite a competitive rate of torpedo fire from when the Enterprise fires torpedoes. I wouldn't fully trust the visual artists. I would more trust the audio cues from on the bridge, the torpedo firing sound effect. I would trust that more than just what the VFX artists show for TOS Remastered. But again, it does suggest a very competitive rate of fire. And again, if you're tying that into, the fact that you've got 2 torpedo launchers down there, not just one, and then suddenly that makes a lot more sense. And it's probably designed very differently, perhaps with slightly less safety protocols. It also ties back to the 22nd century, where of course the torpedo launchers for the original NX are inevitably in the saucer, and actually moving the torpedo launchers into a separate module didn't come till much later, and it makes that kind of technological development far more unique and interesting. So ultimately what you have with the Constitution is very powerful prow phasers, very powerful torpedo launcher, at close range probably, not quite got the power that a Klingon torpedo launcher has. You combine that with good all-round defense. That's perhaps where the D7 is a little bit weaker, but maneuvering is ultimately the key. And really, that's all I have to say on the matter, but I think, yeah. So, in summary, you have a dorsal battery of 6 heavy phasers, 2 port, 2 prow, 2 starboard, a pair of ventral phasers in a turret, which is the one we often see firing, 2 ventral torpedo launchers firing prow, and then an aft phaser battery located below the shuttle bay, and that is the armament of the original Constitution. So I hope you all enjoyed. If you did enjoy, make sure to share your thoughts in the comments. If you can support the channel with a super thanks, that would be greatly appreciated. If you can't, your comments and likes and shares, those are always very much appreciated, so please do that. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below, and I will see you all in the next video. Thank you all for watching. I will now thank my members, my Navarchs, David Reeves, Tully DT, and Jeffrey Ballard. My commanders, Miami Jules, Captain's Quarters, Chase Rector, PQSK, Philip Ty, Jeff Hallam, Bird Monster, Mark Philippe, Robert Sampson, Sean Farrell, Guillermo Martinez, Das Blas, Adam Bowman, and Nathaniel Mead. And I salute my Centurions, Pendlebury, BOS Domestic Disputes, Marcus Hall, Julian Arnott, Freedom Trooper, Oculcatum Questo, Squadra Course, and Gabe Logan. And I thank all my sub-lieutenants. Thank you guys for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.